Up to this point, we've observed that McGrew's approach to gospel differences suffers from a black and white concept of truthful reporting and unsound methodology. Moreover, it does not comport with practical observations of our everyday, ordinary communications. As we begin to switch the focus of our attention to the Gospels in this video, I'm going to discuss more examples of McGrew's methodological missteps. In my book, I provide a few examples in the Gospels in which it appears that one of the authors has altered the chronology of events, and that the alteration was both intentional and not merely a topical arrangement with no chronological ties. It's there that I draw a distinction between three types of chronological reporting: floating chronology, where no timing is stated; explicit chronology, for example, it was 2 days before Passover or later that evening; and implicit chronology. This third category is important since there are different degrees by which timing could be implied. In some instances, the implication that event B had occurred immediately following event A may be present but not strong. The story of Jesus healing a man with a withered hand is a good example of a weakly implied chronology. In all three synoptic Gospels, the story appears immediately after Jesus' dispute with some Jewish leaders on the matter of his disciples picking grain on the Sabbath. Following the dispute, Luke says Jesus went into a synagogue on a different Sabbath and healed a man's withered hand. Mark says nothing of the chronology, and he entered again into their synagogue. But Matthew's wording could imply that the healing had occurred on the same Sabbath as the dispute, and going down from there, he went into their synagogue. If Matthew implied the healing occurred on the same Sabbath, it's weakly implied. In other instances, the implication that event B had occurred immediately following event A may be so strong as to be almost explicit. A nice example is found in the story of Jesus cleansing the temple and cursing a fig tree. Mark narrates that after making his triumphal entry on Palm Sunday, Jesus goes into the temple, looks around, then leaves. He and his disciples then go to Bethany, where they spend the night. On Monday morning, Jesus and his disciples return to Jerusalem. While on their way, Jesus is hungry and sees a fig tree. However, when he observes there are no figs on it, he curses it. They then proceed to Jerusalem. When they arrive, he goes into the temple a second time, this time observing some activities of which he disapproves. So he cleanses the temple, overturning tables and driving away the merchants and money changers. Later that day, Jesus and his disciples leave Jerusalem and return to Bethany, where they will spend another night. On Tuesday morning, they're returning again to Jerusalem. When they come to the fig tree Jesus had cursed on the previous day, they observe it had since withered and died. Matthew narrates the events differently. He also has Jesus going into the temple after his triumphal entry on Palm Sunday. However, Matthew moves the temple cleansing from Monday to Sunday and conflates it with the first temple visit reported by Mark. Later that day, they return to Bethany, where they will spend the night. On Monday morning, Jesus and his disciples are returning to Jerusalem when he sees a fig tree without any figs on it. So he curses the fig tree, and it withers on the spot. Matthew has compressed the account, combining Mark's two-step process into a single step. Matthew does not explicitly state that Jesus cleansed the temple immediately after Jesus' triumphal entry on Palm Sunday. Nor does he explicitly say that the fig tree withered before their very eyes. However, both are so strongly implied that those who would contend otherwise bear the burden of proof. McGrew uses a different approach to distinguishing chronology: achronological and dyschronological. Her term achronological is fairly similar to what I have called floating chronology, while her term dyschronological would be similar to an author narrating an event to have occurred explicitly at a time that he knew differed from the actual time. In my book, I refer to this as synthetic chronological placement and displacement. I'm not fond of McGrew's distinctions because they do not recognize nuances. In fact, the failure to consider implied chronology that varied in strength is yet another instance of McGrew's black and white thinking. For her, even if the timing of an event is strongly implied but not explicitly stated, it's achronological. Therefore, in some cases, a possible tension between the accounts cannot be recognized. But the way people communicate is not always with black and white clarity. In fact, when we describe a series of events that had occurred closely in time, we often don't feel obligated to state the explicit timing of each event. I provide several examples in Chapter 5 of my book where I regard the chronology as being so strongly implied that we probably have synthetic chronological placement. Citing Augustine's attempt to harmonize the day on which Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, McGrew writes, Augustine thus provides evidence against the idea that Christians of his own time accepted dyschronological order. On the contrary, Augustine emphasizes that an apparent discrepancy between chronologies, when the order is apparent, does require harmonization. This is a rejection of dyschronological narration. Augustine's discussion here is utterly at odds with the idea that John would have thought himself licensed to change the year of the temple cleansing, and Augustine himself expressly held that Jesus cleansed the temple twice, stating that 2 cleansings were evident. McGrew is correct that this is what Augustine thought. However, she makes a hasty generalization when she claims this is evidence against the idea that Christians of his own time accepted dyschronological order. All it suggests is that this was Augustine's thinking. Now, there were probably others who agreed with him, but certainly not all. In fact, about 150 years earlier and closer to the time the Gospels were composed, Origen thought quite differently. He had a high view of Scripture and believed that if the Gospels contained discrepancies, one would be required to jettison belief that they are divinely inspired and trustworthy. However, Origen thought discrepancies would have to be in their underlying message rather than in surface details. He then adds, I do not condemn them if they even sometimes dealt freely with things which to the eye of history happened differently, and changed them so as to subserve the mystical aims they had in view, so as to speak of a thing which happened in a certain place as if it had happened in another, or of what took place at a certain time as if it had taken place at another time, and to introduce into what was spoken in a certain way some changes of their own. They proposed to speak the truth where it was possible both materially and spiritually, and where this was not possible, it was their intention to prefer the spiritual to the material. The spiritual truth was often preserved, as one might say, in material falsehood. It's obvious that at least Origen had no problems with the Gospel authors using compositional devices. Though I cannot affirm the totality of Origen's hermeneutical approach to Scripture and everything he believed, for reasons I can't go into here, I do think it's important to note that there's a historical precedent in the early Church, much earlier than Augustine, revealing that compositional devices are not a novel and new idea posited by classicists and New Testament scholars. McGrew has previously written on undesigned coincidences. In my opinion, undesigned coincidences are legitimate phenomena in the Gospels. Of course, some are stronger than others. The one that impresses me most pertains to Jesus' discussion with Pilate. When we read the story in Luke, Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" When Jesus answers in the affirmative, the very next thing Luke reports is that Pilate tells the chief priest and the crowd, "I find no cause for a crime in this man." If we were only to read Luke's account, Pilate's response appears bizarre and unlikely. The Romans were conquerors and had no toleration for rebellion. Herod was merely a client king for the Romans, having only the powers Rome had granted him. So for Jesus to tell Pilate that he's the king of the Jews, implying to Pilate that Rome's approved client king was not, the last thing we would expect for Pilate to say is, I find no cause for a crime in this man. Surely this is a Lucan invention. Well, not so fast. John, who very likely writes without any dependence on Luke, reports Jesus' conversation with Pilate in more detail. When Pilate asks Jesus if he's a king, Jesus says he is, but that his kingdom is not of this world, and that he came to this world to testify to the truth. Pilate then understood that Jesus was no threat to Roman rule, so he said to the Jews gathered, I find no cause for a crime in him. Luke provides a significantly abbreviated version of the conversation between Jesus and Pilate, which seems implausible until the fuller version in John's independent account is presented. It's an undesigned coincidence. I think McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain View, is a nice improvement on J.G. Blunt's book on undesigned coincidences written nearly 200 years earlier. Unfortunately, her black and white concept of truthful reporting leads her to create a false either-or scenario when it comes to compositional devices. She writes, it should be evidenced by this time that the reportage model and the literary device model are incompatible because they give us different concepts of what the authors of the Gospels were attempting to do. A few pages later, she writes, if we think that the statements we find in the biblical narratives are plausibly or even probably fabricated, even in part, we have no reason to think that there may be other confirmation of them, since they are not literally true in the first place. And if we think that such fabrication applies especially to details, then we should not look for the details to be confirmed. This theory makes it much more difficult to see such confirmations clearly when they do arise. The bias in favor of fictionalizing literary devices thus carries a great danger of blinding the theorist to the actual evidence for historicity. Now keep in mind that in positing compositional devices, neither I nor most classicists nor most New Testament scholars are talking about inventing stories about events that had never actually occurred. We are almost always talking about the techniques for paraphrasing and writing narrative taught in the compositional textbooks and the compositional devices regarded by classicists as having a nearly universal presence in ancient historical literature. Most of these are quite minor. However, some are more radical. Here's an example of a rather radical adaptation. Ancient historians agree that when Caesar was returning to Rome after experiencing military victories, many Romans went out on a several days' journey to meet and congratulate him. They also agree there was a meeting between Trebonius and Antony in which the two discussed the possibility of assassinating Caesar. However, we do not know when Trebonius and Antony had this discussion, although it would have been close to the time of Caesar's return to Rome. Many classicists have suggested there were occasions when ancient historians would fabricate some details when they were unknown in order to make for a good narrative. Christopher Pelling has suggested that since Plutarch was unaware of the time and location of the meeting between Trebonius and Antony, he invented the location and timing to have been when they went to meet Caesar on his return to Rome. But notice that Pelling is not suggesting that Plutarch invented the excursion of others to greet Caesar as he returned to Rome. Nor is he suggesting that Plutarch invented the fact that Trebonius and Antony had a conversation about the possibility of assassinating Caesar. He's only suggesting that Plutarch fabricated the time and location of that conversation. Now, McGrew thinks that if the biographical genre made allowance for such a move, a large question mark would hang over many incidents in the historical literature. She adds, the theorists do not have the luxury of confining our skepticism only to those passages that they personally have chosen to question so far, since the devices they advocate would leave no clear tag to mark them out in the text itself. In other words, if ancient authors could engage in some minor fabrication to make for good literature, how can we trust anything they wrote? Well, that's fairly easy to answer. Just as it is with any report in ancient historical literature, some things are fairly easy to verify, others are not so easy, and some cannot be verified. Of course, this does not mean that the unverified item did not occur. It only means we cannot verify that it did. That Jesus was crucified and died as a result is fairly easy to verify. That he fed the 5,000 is not as easy. That he was born of a virgin cannot be verified by the historian. That Jesus caused a great disturbance in the temple is fairly easy to verify. That he said something about the temple being destroyed is fairly easy to verify. That he made the statement when he cleansed the temple is not so easy. Responsible historical work yields conclusions that are carefully nuanced and do not go beyond what the evidence can bear. Still, it's fair to ask just how much flexibility was acceptable in the finer historical writing of that era. In my book, I sought only to identify instances where it's quite plausible that a difference resulted from the author's use of a compositional device. I made no attempt to discuss the limits, other than to observe at the end that the Synoptic Gospels appear to take fewer and smaller liberties with their sources than did most other ancient biographers. Craig Keener has taken the matter further. He and several of his students combed through much of the ancient literature written in the 1st century and within a few centuries of it. They examined the extent of flexibility in their reporting. Of course, some ancient historians exercised greater flexibility than others. Keener concludes with the following general observation in his recent volume, Christobiography. Audiences from the Gospels era did not expect biographers to freely invent events, but they did allow them to flesh out scenes and discourse for the purpose of what they considered narrative verisimilitude. Biographers were not supposed to invent a teacher's message, but they could interpret and communicate it from their own perspectives. If biographers of recent figures in the early empire felt free to adapt wording, chronology, and so forth, then this expectation likewise follows to a reasonable degree of probability for the Gospels. What can be concluded already is that the Synoptics and probably all 4 Gospels fit within the range of variation found in ancient historical sources in general. These sources reflect a significant core of prior information and a degree of flexibility in recounting it. Most ancient historical writing was, in other words, both history and literature, both information and its rhetorical shaping. Traditional skeptical and fundamentalist approaches to the Gospels have generally committed the same error, judging the Gospels by standards foreign to their original genre. Keener subsequently communicated with me in an email that he regards it as being clear that some ancient biographers would craft a scene when certain details were unknown, such as when Pelling suggests that Plutarch crafted the scene where Trebonius aired the possibility of an assassination plot with Antony. In short, ancient authors of historical literature would adapt their sources to varying degrees. However, there was a limit. Good historians did not fabricate events out of nothing. Acknowledging that ancient historians often adapted details and on rare occasions narrated an actual historical event in a context they had created could potentially frustrate McGrew's efforts to identify undesigned coincidences and overturn some of those she puts forth as examples. Perhaps this is what's behind McGrew's passionate resistance to compositional devices. If it is, her fear is disproportionate to the threat posed by compositional devices. Let's return to our example of the discussion between Jesus and Pilate. Let's speculate that, had we been present, we would have heard Jesus answer Pilate's question about whether he was a king with a simple affirmation followed by stating that his kingdom is not of this world and that he had come to communicate the truth. However, having spent a lot of time with Jesus and understanding Jesus' overall message, John adds Jesus' words, "Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Perhaps he might do this because he believed it to be an appropriate occasion for reminding his readers of an earlier time when Jesus says he must bring Gentiles into his flock and they will hear my voice. And a few verses later, my sheep hear my voice. I'm not saying this is what happened. Jesus may indeed have said those words to Pilate about hearing his voice. This is one of those occasions for which there's not enough data for the historian to verify that Jesus uttered those words. However, I present this hypothetical to show that even if Jesus did not utter those final words and John added them for the reason I mentioned, this would do nothing to undermine the undesigned coincidence of John's more detailed version informing Luke's very abbreviated one. Therefore, McGrew's all-or-nothing reasoning is problematic. She claims that if the ancient authors adapted their sources, as many classicists, New Testament scholars, and I have suggested, we could not rely on details such as undesigned coincidences to confirm their accurate reporting, since they are not literally true in the first place. This is a black and white concept of truthful reporting that simply doesn't work. Now, some of you may be thinking that McGrew should take a softer approach. Why not allow one to opt for the approach that best fits the difference at hand, such as harmonization, compositional device, or possibly an error. McGrew recognizes some will be inclined to travel this road, but she discourages it. She writes, "It might be tempting to believe that one can take a smorgasbord approach to undesigned coincidences and literary devices, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. When one has trouble harmonizing an alleged contradiction between two gospel accounts, then one might find it expedient to jump to the literary device school of thought and claim that a literary device, say dischronological displacement, was accepted at the time, explaining the Bible difficulty in that way." But McGrew eschews such an approach. She writes, "The ad hocness and epistemic lack of principle in such an approach is evident when one asks this question: what kind of author is one creating in such a process? Not a psychologically coherent author. If one actually believes that the literary device view of the Gospels is correct, that such fact-changing devices were part and parcel of the Gospel genre, and if one interprets the Gospels consistently in this way, then to be consistent, one should have a high probability from the outset that what appeared to be undesigned coincidences are unlikely to be correctly explained by the activities of literally truthful authors. After all, highly scrupulous, literally truthful authors giving us what they believe to be historically accurate reports, even in matters of detail, are precisely what the literary device view tells us we do not have. The smorgasbord approach is untenable." McGrew's criticisms are saturated with her black and white concept of truthful reporting, while literary sensitivity is given very little attention, if any. For her, authors who are highly scrupulous and literally truthful would never retell the story of Jesus using a parable and alter Jesus asking and answering his own question to having the Jewish leaders answer him with the same answer. They would not consider adding elements to a dialogue in a true story in order to clarify what was said to one belonging to a different ethnic culture. It's also clear that, in her mind, compositional devices pose a serious threat to undesigned coincidences. Now, there may be occasions when a difference resulting from a compositional device discredits one of McGrew's examples of an undesigned coincidence. And there may be occasions when an undesigned coincidence sheds clearer light on a text than appealing to a compositional device. However, they are not mutually exclusive as tools for identifying why there are differences between parallel reports. Black and white thinking argues either or, but a more carefully nuanced approach is more reasonable. This conclusion is once again reinforced by our ordinary conversations. Every spring, I teach a course at Houston Baptist University named Scripture and Apologetics Implications. Students are exposed to various matters in New Testament criticism, such as textual criticism, canonicity, the synoptic problem, gospel authorship, and gospel differences. After reading my book on gospel differences, there are usually a few students in each class who say that, having now been exposed to a different approach to gospel differences that acknowledges the use of compositional devices, they are surprised to observe themselves doing many of the same things in their everyday conversations. Yet they don't at all think they're falsifying their stories or compromising the trustworthiness of their modified accounts. In summary, McGrew's black and white concept of truthful reporting leads her to read into the New Testament literature something its authors never intended, just as she does with literature written by other ancient historians. Her method fails to appreciate the varied degrees of strength by which something can be implied, and it inappropriately insists on an either-or approach to understanding gospel differences. That wraps up this segment. In the next video, I'll be focusing on how McGrew's method plays out in some examples in the Gospels. Do you like the way I distinguish chronological language, or do you prefer McGrew's descriptions? Do you think McGrew made an effective case that classicists and New Testament scholars are mistaken about the use of compositional devices by ancient authors? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section.